The evening sky over Atlanta was painted in shades of orange and gold as the city began to quiet down after a long day. Marcus Reed walked out of a small diner near the edge of town, his usual calm expression on his face. He had finished a simple meal, grilled chicken and black coffee, and paid in cash before stepping into the cool night breeze to anyone watching. He looked like an ordinary man, tall, polite, with a calm confidence that made people feel safe around him. But behind those steady brown eyes was a mind trained for danger. Marcus wasn't just a man living a peaceful life. He was a CIA field agent taking a short break from the chaos of his work. For months, Marcus had been living quietly, using a low profile to blend in. He rented a small apartment above a bookstore, spent his mornings jogging, and his evenings reading or fixing old radios. He liked silence, the kind of peace that didn't ask for anything. He had been through enough undercover missions to crave a life that felt normal. At least for a little while, his neighbors knew him as Mr. Reed, the quiet guy with the kind smile. He always offered to carry groceries for the older woman next door and help the kids fix their bikes. Nobody knew what he truly was, and that was exactly how Marcus wanted it. For him, anonymity was safety. As he drove home that evening in his old gray sedan, he played soft jazz on the radio, tapping the steering wheel lightly with his fingers. The streets were almost empty, streetlights glowing like fireflies in the distance. He thought about his mother, who still lived in Chicago, and how he hadn't called her in a week. Maybe he would surprise her with a visit soon. He thought, but somewhere deep in his mind, a small voice reminded him that peace never lasted long in his world. The quiet before the storm, his mentor once called it. Marcus smiled faintly at the memory. He had learned to enjoy stillness, knowing that chaos always found its way back. He stopped at a red light near an intersection where 2 police cars were parked on the side. He didn't think much of it. Routine patrols were common. But as the light turned green and he drove forward, one of the squad cars pulled out behind him. Flashing its lights, Marcus glanced in the rearview mirror, his brows knitting together slightly. "That's strange," he murmured. He hadn't been speeding, his license was clean, and his taillights worked fine. Still, he slowed down and pulled over calmly. He turned off the engine, rolled down his window, and placed both hands on the steering wheel where they could be seen. 2 officers approached, both white, their flashlights shining into his face. The taller one spoke first, his tone sharp. "License and registration." "Of course, officer," Marcus said politely. Handing over the documents, his voice was calm, steady, the same tone he used during interrogations in far more dangerous situations. The second officer leaned slightly forward, squinting at him. "You in a hurry tonight?" he asked. "No, sir," Marcus replied. "Just heading home." The taller officer circled his car, peering through the backseat window. "You live around here?" "Yes, a few blocks away," Marcus answered. "Is there a problem?" "Maybe," the officer said slowly. "You fit the description of someone we're looking for." Marcus blinked, confused but still composed. "I see. And what's that person accused of?" "Robbery," the second officer said. "Couple blocks from here. We just need to ask a few questions," Marcus nodded, keeping his voice respectful. "I understand, but I can assure you, I just left the diner down the street. You can check with the owner." "Step out of the vehicle," the taller cop interrupted. His tone turning cold, Marcus hesitated for a second, then complied. He knew better than to argue. His training had taught him that anger only escalated things. Still, his instincts buzzed quietly. Something felt wrong. The officers were too tense, too eager. It didn't feel like a normal stop as he stepped out. The second officer placed a hand on his holster. "Keep your hands where I can see them," he said. "They're right here," Marcus replied calmly. Raising his hands slightly, the taller officer circled him again, his flashlight moving from Marcus's shoes to his face. "What do you do for a living, Mr. Reed?" Marcus gave a small neutral smile. "I work in federal contracting," he said truthfully but vaguely. "Federal, huh?" The officer sneered. "You saying you're some kind of government man?" Marcus met his gaze steadily. "Just saying I work with people who keep things running." That answer seemed to annoy them. Within seconds, the taller one barked, "Turn around." "Hands on the hood," Marcus froze. "Excuse me?" "You heard me," the officer snapped. "You're being detained for questioning." Marcus exhaled slowly. Feeling the tension rise, he knew if he pushed back, things could get worse. So he complied. placing his palms flat on the hood of his car. The cold metal sent a chill through his skin. As one of the officers cuffed his hands, the other whispered mockingly, "You think you're smart, huh? You'll be lucky if you see daylight again." Marcus didn't respond, but inside his mind was calculating every detail. Their badge numbers, their positions, the time, the make of their patrol car. Every bit of information was being stored. His years of CIA training kicked in automatically. When they shoved him into the back seat of the squad car, Marcus looked out the window, watching the diner lights fade behind him. He didn't feel fear, only a quiet disappointment. The same world he had risked his life to protect was now treating him like a criminal because of the color of his skin. But Marcus Reed wasn't an ordinary man. He wasn't a helpless victim. And while those officers thought they had control, they had no idea they had just arrested one of the most skilled intelligence agents in the country. The storm had finally arrived, only this time, it wasn't Marcus who was unprepared, it was them. The hum of the police cruiser was the only sound breaking the silence as Marcus sat in the back seat, the flashing red and blue lights painting his face through the glass. The cuffs around his wrists were tight, biting into his skin, but he didn't flinch. His expression stayed calm, too calm for a man accused of robbery. The two officers in the front seat glanced at each other, confused by his quiet composure. Most people start begging or yelling by now, the taller cop muttered. Smirking. Guess this one's too proud. Marcus didn't respond. He stared out the window, his mind quietly analyzing everything. He had memorized the car's number, the officers' badge names, and even the small camera mounted on the dashboard. He could tell from its blinking red light that it wasn't recording. The officers had turned it off. That was his first real clue. They pulled up to a small, dimly lit police station on the outskirts of the city. The place looked like it hadn't been updated in years. Cracked tiles, buzzing fluorescent lights, and a flag that hung crooked on the wall. The officers dragged Marcus inside, their voices filled with arrogance. Got the suspect from the store robbery, one of them announced proudly. Caught him trying to play innocent. Marcus was led into a narrow room with a metal chair and table. He sat down quietly, his hands still cuffed. His heart rate was steady. He had been trained to stay in control. But deep inside he could feel the sharp sting of injustice. He had served his country for nearly a decade, risked his life in countries that didn't even exist on maps, and now he was sitting in a small-town interrogation room, treated like a criminal by men who had no idea who he really was. The taller cop, Officer Blake, dropped a file on the table with a dramatic thud. "You know why you're here, don't you?" Marcus looked up calmly. "You said something about a robbery." "Don't play dumb," the second officer, Carter, snapped, pacing around him. "We've got you on camera leaving the scene." Marcus raised an eyebrow slightly. "That's impossible," he said. "I was having dinner at the diner on Main Street." "You can ask the staff," Blake chuckled. Sure. That's what they all say." He leaned forward, his breath heavy with coffee and pride. "Look, man, you cooperate. Tell us who you're working with. And maybe we'll talk to the DA, but keep lying. And you'll be in prison before you can blink." Marcus tilted his head, his voice calm but firm. "I have nothing to confess." Carter slammed his hand on the table. "You think you're clever? You people always think you can outsmart the system." That last word, "you people," hung in the air like poison. Marcus's jaw tightened slightly, but he didn't react. Years of training had taught him how to mask anger. He simply looked Carter in the eye and said softly, "The truth has a funny way of catching up." The officers laughed, not realizing that every cruel word, every lie they spoke, was being recorded, just not by them. What they didn't know was that Marcus's wristwatch wasn't ordinary. It was a CIA-issued micro-recorder capable of storing up to 48 hours of high-definition audio and video, and right now it was documenting everything. Hours passed and the officers continued their aggressive questioning. They took his phone, searched his car without a warrant, and fabricated a report stating they had found stolen jewelry in the trunk. Marcus watched it all happen, his face emotionless. His instincts told him not to reveal who he was. Not yet. At one point, Carter leaned against the wall, smirking. "You're going away for a long time." Buddy, Marcus looked up, his calm eyes steady as ever. "If I were you," he said quietly, "I'd start worrying about what happens when the truth comes out." Blake snorted. "Oh, and what's that supposed to mean?" Marcus's lips curved into the faintest smile. "It means I don't stay caged for long." The officers ignored the warning, too blinded by their own arrogance to notice the confidence in his tone. They filed their report, forged his signature on a confession statement, and placed him in a holding cell as the door slammed shut. Marcus exhaled slowly and sat down on the narrow bench. He leaned his head back, staring at the ceiling. The faint hum of the fluorescent lights buzzed above. He knew the CIA's internal system monitored the status of their agents' equipment. Within 24 hours, his watch's signal would be flagged for unauthorized detainment. Someone would come looking for him? But Marcus wasn't planning to wait that long. Through the small barred window, he could see the moonlight cutting across the floor. For the first time since the arrest, he let himself smile. They really have no idea who they're messing with, he whispered under his breath. Outside the holding cell, the two officers were laughing, celebrating their big catch, bragging to other cops about how they took down a thug. But inside that quiet cell, Marcus Reed, the man they thought was helpless, was already planning every step of how this would end. And when it did, it wouldn't just be an arrest. It would be an explosion of truth so powerful that the entire courtroom, and the world beyond it, would never forget the name Marcus Reed again. The night dragged on at the small precinct, and the air inside the interrogation room felt thick with tension. The fluorescent lights buzzed softly above Marcus as he sat at the metal table. Wrists still cuffed, the two officers, Blake and Carter, had stepped out for a break, leaving him alone with his thoughts. His breathing was slow, steady, practiced, but inside, he was processing every detail like a machine. Every word they had said, every move they made, it was all being recorded by the tiny CIA-grade microchip hidden behind the face of his wristwatch. When the door creaked open again, Blake returned with a coffee cup and a smirk. "You're one calm criminal," he said mockingly, setting the cup down. "Most guys are crying or begging by now." Marcus lifted his eyes slowly. "You mistake calm for guilt, officer," he said evenly. "But one of us is going to regret that," Carter laughed, leaning against the wall. "You sound like a movie character," he said. "Maybe you should have been an actor instead of a thief." Marcus didn't bother to respond this time. He had dealt with men like them before, men who mistook power for control. But he also knew arrogance had a way of blinding people to danger. Blake sat across from him and slid a folder across the table. "See this?" he said, tapping on a printed report. "Your fingerprints, your car, your face, everything ties you to the robbery." Marcus's eyes moved slowly across the papers. He recognized immediately that the evidence was fake. The timestamps were off. The pictures poorly edited. "Interesting," he murmured. "You even forged the serial number, that's sloppy." The officers froze, surprised by how calmly he had spotted it. Carter frowned. "You calling us liars?" Marcus leaned back slightly, the metal cuffs clinking softly. "I'm saying you're not as careful as you think," he said. "And when people who are careful start looking into this, they're going to find every mistake you just made." Blake slammed his palm on the table. "You're lucky I don't charge you for resisting arrest." He barked. Marcus didn't flinch. "You already lied once," he said quietly. "Why stop there?" The tension snapped like a wire. Carter lunged forward, grabbing Marcus by the collar. "You think you're untouchable?" he hissed. Marcus's voice dropped to a dangerous calm. "If you knew who I was," he said softly, "you wouldn't have laid a hand on me." The door opened suddenly, and another officer stuck his head in. "Chief wants to see you." "Now," he said to Blake. Both men left the room. Muttering under their breath, Marcus sat alone again, staring at the one-way mirror. He knew someone was behind it, watching him. But what they didn't know was that he wasn't just being watched, he was watching them. Outside the room, the precinct's security cameras were still rolling. And through a secure CIA network, Marcus's watch was already transmitting the audio feed. At that very moment, a team of analysts at Langley was listening in real time. One of them muttering, "He's been compromised. But he's in control." Marcus had been trained for worst-case scenarios, but this situation was personal. It wasn't an enemy nation or a terrorist group. It was the very system he had sworn to protect. He closed his eyes, letting his heartbeat steady, and thought of the plan forming in his mind. He wouldn't reveal his identity yet, not until he had gathered enough to expose their corruption fully. Hours passed, and just before dawn, the chief himself walked in. A heavy-set man with tired eyes and a badge that had lost its shine. "Mr. Reed," he said gruffly, "you've been accused of a serious crime. You're not helping yourself by keeping quiet." Marcus looked up, his gaze sharp. Sometimes silence helps more than speaking, he said calmly. Especially when the wrong people are listening. The chief frowned uneasy. What's that supposed to mean? Marcus tilted his head slightly. It means this entire room is bugged, he said simply. The chief blinked. Excuse me? Marcus gave a faint smile. Every word that's been spoken here tonight is being recorded and transmitted as we speak. The chief's face drained of color. By who? By the same people you shouldn't have messed with, Marcus said, leaning forward. But you'll find out soon enough. The chief stepped back, confused and nervous, and left the room without a word. Moments later, the building's phone lines lit up. The precinct received an urgent call from a restricted number, one traced directly to Washington, D.C. In that instant, panic rippled through the station. The same officers who mocked Marcus earlier were now whispering nervously, wondering who exactly they had arrested. Meanwhile, in the interrogation room, Marcus sat quietly, his face unreadable. He knew what was coming next, the moment when the lies would start to collapse, piece by piece until the truth exploded in the most public way possible. But for now he remained still, calm as ever, the faintest hint of a smile crossing his lips. The storm he had warned them about was closer than they thought, and when it finally arrived, no one in that precinct or in that courtroom would ever forget the name Marcus Reed, the man they dared to accuse. The morning sun crept through the small barred window of the holding cell, slicing across the concrete floor in thin lines of gold. Marcus sat on the edge of his bunk, his posture straight, his eyes steady. He had barely slept, not because of fear, but because his mind had been working all night, calculating, planning, and waiting. His watch, the same one the officers had ignored, had already done its job by now. His superiors at Langley knew exactly where he was and what had happened. Outside the cell, the station buzzed with uneasy chatter. The two officers, Blake and Carter, stood near the coffee machine whispering, "Did you hear the call from D.C. last night?" Carter muttered. The chief looked like he'd seen a ghost. Blake shrugged, trying to sound calm. "Relax, they're just checking up. It's probably nothing." But the tension in his voice betrayed him. Meanwhile, Marcus remained still, eyes closed, listening. He had trained for situations far worse than this. Extraction missions gone wrong. Double agents, ambushes, but this felt different. This wasn't a battlefield in another country. This was home. And home wasn't supposed to treat its own this way. The cell door creaked open, and the chief stepped in, holding a file in one hand and a phone in the other. "Reed," he said cautiously. "You've got someone who wants to talk to you." Marcus raised an eyebrow. "Who?" The chief hesitated. "They didn't say their name, but they outrank me." Marcus took the phone and held it to his ear. The voice on the other end was calm, firm, and unmistakably authoritative. "Agent Reed, this is Deputy Director Lane." The air in the room shifted. Blake, standing outside the cell, froze at the mention of the title. Marcus's tone didn't change. "Sir," he said. "Good morning. We've been monitoring everything," Lane continued. "The local authorities overstepped. We're dispatching a federal team to handle this discreetly, but I need you to remain in character for now." Marcus glanced toward the officers watching him nervously. "Understood," he said quietly. "You'll have what you need soon." The line went dead. Marcus handed the phone back to the chief. "You should start writing your resignation," he said evenly. The chief frowned. "What?" "You'll understand soon enough," Marcus replied, his voice calm but cold. An hour later, two men in suits walked into the precinct. They didn't wear badges, just carried briefcases and quiet authority. "We're here for Marcus Reed," one of them said. "We're transferring him into federal custody." The chief hesitated. "Who exactly are you?" The man handed him a folded document with a red seal. "You don't have clearance to ask," he said flatly. The chief read it and went pale. Yes, of course," he stammered. Unlocking the cell, Marcus stepped out, straightening his cuffs. "Gentlemen," he said politely. The agents nodded. "Let's get you out of here." "Sir," as they escorted him out. The officers watched in stunned silence. "Sir?" Blake called out. "What's going on?" Marcus paused at the door and turned slightly, his gaze locked on them, cool and unwavering. "You'll find out when the truth hits the courtroom," he said. The station erupted in murmurs as the black car drove away. Inside, Marcus sat quietly in the back seat. The senior agent beside him glanced over. "You handled it well, Reed." Marcus looked out the window. They underestimated me, that's their first mistake. The agent nodded. What's the plan now? Marcus's tone sharpened. Expose them, but not just those two. The department tried to bury this, someone has to make it public. By the time they reached the federal facility, the CIA already had the entire case file, every forged document, every falsified report, every second of the interrogation audio. Analysts pieced it together like a puzzle, preparing to deliver it all to the court days later. The story broke to the media. Federal agent detained by local police in racially charged arrest. The internet exploded with outrage. Protests filled the streets and reporters camped outside the courthouse. Blake and Carter were suddenly national villains. Their smug confidence shattered. They tried to spin their story, claiming they were just doing their job. But the evidence told another story. The footage from Marcus's watch had gone viral, showing their mockery, their threats, and their lies. In the quiet of his temporary safe house, Marcus sat at a wooden table reading through the court documents. Anna, one of his CIA colleagues, stood nearby. You sure you want to face them in person? She asked. You could let the agency handle this. Marcus looked up, his eyes steady. No, he said. They need to see me, the man they accused, the man they thought they could destroy. Anna nodded slowly. And when they see you? He leaned back, a faint smile crossing his lips. The truth won't just come out, he said. It'll explode. Outside, the night was calm again. But inside Marcus Reed's world, the storm had just begun. And this time, he wasn't just defending himself. He was about to redefine what justice looked like, one courtroom at a time. The courthouse steps were crowded with flashing cameras and murmuring reporters, all waiting for the man whose name had set the nation on fire. Marcus Reed. The black SUV pulled up, its doors opening slowly, and Marcus stepped out in a crisp gray suit, calm and composed. His every move carried quiet authority. The officers who had once mocked him were already inside, their faces pale, their arrogance stripped away by the storm that was now coming for them. As he entered the courtroom, whispers rippled through the audience. Some people saw him as a symbol of strength, others as a mystery, but everyone knew they were about to witness something extraordinary. The judge, a sharp-eyed woman with years of experience, called the court to order. This hearing will determine whether the charges against the officers stand, and whether Mr. Marcus Reed's detainment was lawful, she said. Her tone neutral but firm. Marcus took his seat beside his attorney, a seasoned woman named Evelyn Hayes, known for her precision and confidence. She glanced at him and whispered, "Are you ready?" Marcus's lips curved slightly. More than they'll ever be. Across the room, officers Blake and Carter sat stiffly, dressed in their formal uniforms, trying to look composed. Their lawyer whispered frantically, but they barely listened. Their eyes darted toward Marcus, fear flickering behind their forced calm. The prosecution began confidently, presenting the original arrest report. Your Honor, these officers acted on probable cause, the prosecutor declared. The suspect matched the description and was found in proximity to the crime. Evelyn stood up slowly. Objection, she said. The term suspect is misleading. My client is a decorated federal officer. He wasn't a suspect. He was a target, the courtroom murmured. The judge raised an eyebrow. A federal officer? Evelyn nodded. Yes, Your Honor, and we have documentation to prove it. She handed the judge a thick folder stamped with the CIA's insignia. The moment the seal came into view, the entire courtroom fell silent. Blake shifted uncomfortably in his chair, whispering, This can't be real. Carter's hands trembled slightly. Evelyn continued, But that's not all, Your Honor. We also have irrefutable evidence of what truly happened that night. She walked toward the large screen mounted on the wall and pressed a button on a small remote. The lights dimmed, the video began to play. The footage came straight from Marcus's wristwatch camera, clear, uncut and brutally honest. The jury watched as the officers' voices filled the room, their tone filled with arrogance and prejudice. You people think you can outsmart us, one of them said on the video. The next moment showed Marcus calm and composed, replying softly, Truth has a way of catching up. Gasps echoed around the courtroom. The prosecutor's face drained of color. The video continued, showing the officers planting evidence, laughing and turning off their patrol cam. When the footage ended, silence fell, a heavy, suffocating silence. The judge leaned forward slowly, her voice low but firm. "Officers, is this accurate footage?" Neither of them spoke. Blake opened his mouth, but no words came. Carter looked down at his hands, shaking. Evelyn turned to Marcus. "Would you like to say something, Mr. Reed?" Marcus stood up, his voice calm, steady, and commanding. "I don't stand here for revenge," he said. "I stand here because truth matters. I served this country believing in justice. And yet I was treated as guilty because of how I looked, not who I was." He paused, letting the weight of his words fill the room. "Those who wear the badge should honor it, not hide behind it." The judge's eyes glistened as she nodded slowly. "You're right, Mr. Reed," she said softly. The defense tried to speak, but their words faltered under the mountain of evidence. It was no longer a trial, it was an awakening. By the time the verdict came, the courtroom was buzzing with emotion. The officers were stripped of their positions and taken into custody, and the city's police chief announced an internal investigation into systemic misconduct. Reporters rushed forward as Marcus left the courtroom, microphones flashing in his face. "Agent Reed, how does it feel to have the truth finally out?" One shouted. Marcus stopped, looked directly into the nearest camera and said quietly, "Truth doesn't need to be loud, it just needs to be real." The clip went viral overnight. Millions watched it, millions shared it. But Marcus didn't care about fame, he cared about change that night. As he stood by his apartment window, the city lights reflecting off the glass, he whispered to himself, "It's done." But deep down he knew it wasn't over. This wasn't just his victory, it was a message, because sometimes justice doesn't arrive with sirens and applause, it arrives in silence, carried by those strong enough to let truth speak for itself. The courtroom had fallen silent after the verdict. But for Marcus Reed, the sound of truth had only just begun to echo. The officers were led away in handcuffs, their faces pale and broken, while the cameras outside the courthouse captured every second. The entire country had seen the footage, heard the lies, and watched the system turn against its own corruption. For the first time in years, justice didn't just whisper, it roared. But Marcus didn't walk out smiling. He wasn't a man who celebrated victories. He carried them like responsibilities. The media shouted his name as he stepped down the courthouse stairs, microphones thrust toward him. "Agent Reed, do you feel vindicated? Will you press charges? What's your message to the nation?" He stopped only once, turning to face the crowd. His voice was calm, deliberate. "Justice is never revenge," he said. "It's the truth." Finally standing tall the next morning, his words were everywhere, on television screens, news headlines, and social media feeds. "Justice is never revenge" trended for days. People across the country began sharing their own stories of racial profiling, false arrests, and corruption. Marcus had unknowingly become a symbol, not just of truth but of transformation. Behind the scenes, however, the story wasn't over. The CIA quietly handled the internal damage caused by the public exposure. But they also recognized what Marcus had done. He had turned a personal injustice into a global conversation about integrity and accountability. When he returned to headquarters, the director himself waited for him. "You caused quite a storm out there, Reed," the man said with a hint of admiration. Marcus smiled faintly. "Truth tends to do that," the director chuckled softly. "You know, not many agents could have handled it the way you did," he said. "The president personally sent a note of commendation." Marcus looked surprised. "For telling the truth?" "No," the director said quietly. "For reminding the world what it means to stand for it." In the months that followed, Marcus was promoted to a senior position in a new task force dedicated to investigating domestic corruption cases. His mission was clear: expose the lies that hide behind power. His experience made him the perfect man for the job, and his story gave him the credibility that no badge ever could. But even as his career rose, Marcus stayed grounded. He returned to the same diner where it all began, sitting in the same corner booth, sipping black coffee. The waitress smiled when she recognized him. "You're that man from the news," she said. "The one who stood up to the cops." Marcus shook his head gently. "No," he said. "I just stood up for the truth." Outside, the streets buzzed with life again. People honked their horns, kids laughed, and the same city that once watched him get arrested now watched him with respect. Later that week, the judge who had presided over his case requested a private meeting. Marcus agreed. When he arrived, she stood up and greeted him warmly. "Agent Reed," she said, "I've been a judge for 25 years, and I've never seen a case change so many lives." Marcus replied quietly, It changed mine too. She nodded, her eyes soft. You made me remember why I took this job. To protect justice. Not just enforce it, she said. You reminded me that sometimes one truth is enough to wake an entire system. As Marcus left her office, he paused for a moment, looking back. Thank you, Your Honor, he said, for listening when the truth finally spoke. That night, as he stood on his balcony overlooking the glowing city skyline, he reflected on everything. He wasn't just a survivor of injustice anymore. He was living proof that integrity could outlast deceit. His phone buzzed with a message from a number he didn't recognize. It read, "Because of you, I became a cop to make things right. Thank you." Marcus smiled, staring at the message for a long moment before setting the phone down. The sky above him was clear, and for the first time, he felt peace. Not because the fight was over, but because he knew it had been worth it. The storm had come, the truth had exploded, and the world had finally seen what happens when courage meets injustice. And as the night stretched over the city, one thing was certain. Marcus Reed's story wasn't just about being accused. It was about becoming the man who proved that even in a world full of lies, truth always finds a way to rise. The weeks after the courtroom explosion changed everything. The video of the trial, the lies, the reveal, the truth, had spread across the internet like wildfire. News anchors debated it, activists quoted it, and students in law schools studied it. The world suddenly knew Marcus Reed's name. But to Marcus, fame meant nothing. He had spent years working in the shadows for his country, and now, ironically, it was the truth that dragged him into the light. One morning, he stood by the window of his apartment, the skyline glimmering under the sunrise. On the news, a reporter spoke his name again, calling him the CIA agent who turned injustice inside out. Marcus exhaled slowly, sipping his coffee. They make it sound like I planned it, he murmured, half amused. In reality, all he had done was what every man should do, refuse to bow to lies. His phone buzzed with constant messages, calls from journalists, offers from talk shows, even a movie producer who wanted to adapt his incredible story. Marcus ignored them all. He wasn't chasing attention. He was chasing change. That same day, he met with the director of national operations at CIA headquarters. The man leaned across the desk and said, "Reed, whether you like it or not, you've become a public figure. You've shown the world that truth still exists inside the system. That's bigger than any mission you've completed." Marcus gave a small smile. "Then let's make it count," he said, and he did. With the agency's quiet backing, Marcus began working on a national initiative called the Integrity Project. It focused on reforming local law enforcement, using technology to track accountability, and providing training programs that tackled racial bias and corruption from the inside out. The man who once sat in handcuffs was now reshaping the very system that had tried to destroy him. But change didn't come easily. Many officials resisted him. Some called him a traitor in a suit, accusing him of embarrassing law enforcement. Others saw him as a hero. To Marcus, none of it mattered. He wasn't here to be liked. He was here to make sure what happened to him never happened to anyone else. One afternoon, while speaking at a public conference on justice reform, Marcus shared something that silenced the entire room. "Power isn't the problem," he said. "The lack of accountability is. When power has no conscience, injustice becomes routine." The audience rose to their feet in applause, many with tears in their eyes. Among them was Judge Carter, the same woman who had once ruled against him. After the event, she approached him quietly. "Mr. Reed," she said softly, "you taught me something I'll never forget. That justice doesn't end with a verdict. It begins with humility." Marcus nodded. "And humility," he said, "is what makes power human." A few days later, he received a message from one of the recruits in the police academy, where he'd spoken earlier. It read, "Because of your story, I joined to make a difference, not to follow orders." Marcus smiled at the message, realizing that real change didn't happen in courtrooms, it happened in hearts. Late that night, sitting alone in his office, Marcus looked through a file of names. People wrongfully convicted, men and women still fighting for freedom. He whispered to himself, "We're not done yet." Outside, the wind moved softly through the city. Billboards still flashed his face, documentaries still aired his story. But Marcus didn't care. What mattered wasn't the noise, it was the silence after it. The change that followed. He glanced at the photograph on his desk, his mother's smile, framed beside his agency badge, and said quietly, "You were right, Mom. The truth always finds its way home." And in that quiet moment, Marcus Reed understood something deeper than justice. The truth didn't just free him, it gave him a purpose bigger than himself. Because sometimes the most powerful revolutions don't start with riots or speeches. They start with one man's decision to stand still in the face of a lie and let the truth speak louder than fear. The night sky over Washington glowed softly with city lights, and for the first time in a long while, Marcus Reed felt at peace. He stood on the rooftop of the CIA headquarters, the wind brushing against his suit, the hum of the city below like a living heartbeat. So much had changed since the night he was falsely accused, since two officers mistook dignity for defiance and silence for guilt. The man who once sat in handcuffs was now the man people looked to for hope, for truth, for strength. It had been a year since the court case that shook the nation. The Integrity Project Marcus founded had expanded across multiple states. Police academies now used his story as part of their ethics training. Officers were being taught to see citizens not as suspects but as humans first. And every time Marcus heard a young cadet say, "Sir, we want to make things right," he felt something deep inside, something like healing. But despite his growing fame, Marcus lived quietly. He still drove the same old car, still went to the same diner on the corner of 8th Street, where the waitress always smiled and said, "The usual, Mr. Reed," and he still sent money each month to a fund helping victims of false convictions. He didn't need awards or cameras. His peace came from knowing that his truth had outlived their lies. One afternoon, as he prepared to speak at a global human rights summit, a young journalist caught up with him backstage. "Agent Reed," she asked shyly, "after everything you've been through, do you believe the world can really change?" Marcus paused, his gaze thoughtful. "The world doesn't change overnight," he said gently. "But people do, and when people change, the world follows." When he walked on stage, the crowd rose to their feet in applause. Thousands of faces from dozens of nations looked at him with admiration. But Marcus didn't see fans, he saw believers. Believers in justice, in truth, in humanity. He began speaking, his deep voice steady and clear. "I once thought justice was something given to us," he said. "But I learned it's something we must protect. The truth doesn't need an army, it just needs one person brave enough to stand by it. I was one man in handcuffs, but I had something stronger than power. I had truth. And when truth stands long enough, lies crumble by themselves." The audience was silent, every word sinking deep. Then came the standing ovation, one that felt less like applause and more like gratitude. Cameras flashed, but Marcus didn't pose. He simply bowed his head, humble as ever. Later that evening, as the crowd dispersed, a familiar figure approached him. It was Judge Carter, the woman who had once sentenced him. "You've turned pain into purpose," she said quietly. "Do you ever regret forgiving us?" Marcus smiled gently, his eyes warm but wise. "No, Your Honor," he said, "because forgiveness freed me long before the system did. If I carried anger, I'd still be in a prison, just without bars." The judge's eyes glistened and she nodded, speechless. As Marcus stepped outside, the night air greeted him again. The city lights shimmered like stars, and the wind carried the distant echo of sirens, reminders of the world he was trying to fix. He looked up at the sky and whispered, "We're getting there." And in that moment, it was clear. Marcus Reed's story wasn't about revenge or redemption. It was about resurrection. The resurrection of faith in justice, of dignity in the face of hate, and of truth in a world drowning in lies. Years from now, people would still tell his story. The man falsely accused who taught the world what it truly means to forgive. And somewhere in every police academy classroom, every courtroom and every soul who had ever been wronged, Marcus's words would live on. Truth doesn't shout, it endures. And just like that, the man who once lost his freedom became a legend of conscience, proving that even in a world built on power and deceit, truth will always find a voice, and when it does, the world listens.